Hi, welcome to Bipolar Afterthoughts. I'm Liam, and based off of the title of this video, you may have thought that this is about something it really isn't. You know, this is not some beta alpha male crap. And if you thought it was from the title, and if you came here looking for that, then honestly, I'm glad that you did not find that. But I am hoping that you are willing to learn from it, from what I have to say. And, with that being said, this does go over sensitive topics. SA being the most obvious, so viewer discretion is advised. So let's get some things out of the way here. Okay, I do not in any way, shape, or form think that women should be less focused on. Nor do I think it's a bad thing about how much information we have, along with resources and help that's available for them. In fact, there should be more of it. It's just being a man, I can't speak to their experiences. I can speak to being a survivor of this crime as a man myself. And by trying to find research about SA, specifically on men, I found it rather difficult to find accurate information. And how limited the information I could find was, and how infuriating it is to me that not more is being done for a man who's gone through this ordeal. I just want to say to either gender, it doesn't matter if it was done to you by your husband or your wife. It doesn't matter if you were drunk. It doesn't matter if it was your friend. Things you'd think would be common sense, but unfortunately don't seem to be so, especially when it comes to men. And even though this video is titled #MenToo, I do realize that #MeToo does include men. I just wanted to open the discussion to focus more so on the things that happen to men, because it isn't focused on enough. And like I said earlier, I do not think it should be taken away from the discussion on what happens to women. However, there just really should be more about men. And, even though the research on this topic on women has been given the necessary and deserved attention, it still even needs more. But the research regarding men in the same subject is considered to be at least 20 years behind that of women. 20 years behind. Can you imagine that? I mean, think about that. We already know that when it comes to SA and women and underreporting, there's still so much more that needs to be looked into. So much more resources, so much more help, so much more information and reporting and feeling safe like you can do so. And so imagine that with women, but then with the same thing happening to men, it is 20 years behind in terms of all of those things I just mentioned. And that includes the help and support that anyone goes through with this horrific crime that is in need of help. And more research was done into male victims under the age of 18 rather than fully grown men. And even those results came up with extremely mixed reviews. However, the most agreed upon statistic that I could find was that 16% of men experienced some form of SA before the age of 18. 16% of men. However, for instance, much more needed studying literature covering adult men have a disturbing large gap in findings. And I know what I just said probably made no sense. But what I mean here is, like, with with some research, the study found it was 0.6%, and others found it to be 8%. So that is an alarming gap in and of itself. Of all reported cases, it's estimated that about 10% come from men. Reported cases as in called the police and actually went through with some sort of court procedures. And, the ones who are most at risk of this for men are male prisoners for some, obvious reasons. And the other ones, though, are college students aged 18 to 25. They're the second. And in fact, they have been found to be 5 times more likely to be a victim of SA than other men aged 18 to 25 who aren't going to college. And I found that to be very interesting. And while I'm largely trying to stay talking about the United States, it's worth noting that up until 1994, men couldn't be considered to have been sexually assaulted criminally in the UK, since the definition said it had to mean forceful penetration of the vagina. You could still charge someone with buggery or budgery. I'm not really sure the pronunciation there, but I don't really care because it's rather insulting, because that came with a punishment of a fine. That was 1994. That was not that long ago. It really was not. And now the question for me is why? Why is this type of violence against men so difficult to find facts about, when compared to the same thing with women? And, in the Roman Empire, same-sex rape was considered as a power move. It was to quote-unquote dominate the victim. And that's disgusting. But it had the man who did the crime be seen as superior. And some of which we can see seep into the culture surrounding it even today. Not in the way you may think, but we'll get more on that a little bit later. In 2011, the CDC reported results from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, and also known as the NISVS. One of the most comprehensive surveys of sexual victimizations conducted in the United States to date. And it found that men and women actually had a similar number in SA. 1.270 million women and 1.267 million men. I mean, do you see how small of a difference that is? It is so minuscule. And to add insult to injury, when the study was published, all of the focus went to women. And, a lot of that has to do with society, which is why I mentioned the Roman Empire thing earlier, partly anyways. We often see men as the perpetrator and women as the victims, which that is true. That can be true, of course. It's just a cultural thing, a societal norm to see it that way. So when this study was published that showed it, the gap between who was the victim wasn't really that different, that didn't make a difference. That just shows how society pushes back on men who have been SA'd. And that is very disturbing, to say the least. And, you know, though there are various reasons a person who went through an SA experience won't report, with both men and women known to underreport, but for men, it gets a little bit more complicated. If a heterosexual man is attacked by another man, then they often fear being perceived as weak or they question their masculinity. If a man of another sexual orientation gets attacked, has yet to come out, they may feel that they'd be forced to do just that, come out. If a man is SA'd by a woman, and yes, that does happen, then it'll likely be seen as, how? How could that man retain that erection? Forget about, just forget about body betrayal. How could that 6-foot man not fight off that 5-foot woman? Imagine he takes that to court. I mean, seriously, put yourself in that situation just for a second. A heterosexual man takes that to court. How can you trust that the jury will not fall back onto that toxic and outdated belief that a man cannot be SA'd by a woman? And imagine any of these being taken to court. For a straight man, the defense would try and dig up dirt, saying it was a consensual act because of A, B, and C from his past, and now he just doesn't want to admit his sexuality. Not to mention having to tell a room full of people, everything that he went through. One of the most embarrassing and traumatic events that can happen. And having to himself, due to the fact that it does often result in a man feeling less masculine, quote unquote, admitting he wasn't masculine enough to a courtroom full of people after detailing what he went through. That is horrifying. Can you seriously, that's why I'm asking you to imagine going through that. Okay? And a non-heterosexual man that still hasn't come out would either be outed by the trial or by themselves to avoid looking like a liar to prevent the defense from using that same strategy I just mentioned for heterosexual men. Homophobia plays a part in this as well, be it from the victim, the jury, and of course society. Now, let's get into some of the myths and facts, okay? So, the myth: during SA, boys and men cannot be sexually aroused. The fact actually couldn't be far from it. If a boy is being groomed and liked the attention, if a boy or man got aroused during it, that does not mean he wanted it or liked being manipulated, groomed, or SA'd. Heterosexual men can even get and keep an erection, something I referenced earlier, because of body betrayal. And another myth: men and boys cannot even be SA'd. That's still a conception out there. They cannot even be SA'd. The fact, a man or boy can definitely become a victim of this crime, and that has nothing to do with how masculine they are whatsoever. And the myth is that this type of abuse is less harmful to men or boys than it is to women or girls. And it is not. While it can harm both sexes in different ways, it is very much equally damaging. And another myth is that only homosexual men commit SA. The fact is that, like typically any crime, you know, this one isn't committed by only one group of people. Straight men and women are just as likely to commit this crime. It is not just someone who is homosexual. Studies have proven that over and over. The very limited studies, may I add. And here are some other myths that I'll just quickly tell you by the facts. Being a survivor does not mean you are homosexual. Well, it's a common trope that most men who get SA'd go on to continue the cycle. It's actually a very, very small percent that actually do. Also, if you are under the incorrect belief that men who have this happen to them by women are lucky, well, just go touch some grass, please. Do the planet a favor and do that, because that is a horrific belief. If you are 16 and your teacher, the hot teacher, essays the student, the boys in his class, oh, you're so lucky. Maybe even the jury will find it, be like, oh, if I were that age, I'd really want, that 20-something-year-old teacher. And that is just disgusting. That is, if you think that on any level, you really need to look at yourself in the mirror. And, you may hold some of these beliefs due to your upbringing or society in its whole, It may be a belief that you're not even fully aware of because it could be hidden in your subconscious. However, believing any of these toxic views on men and boys getting SA'd are only contributing to the problem. And it creates long-term effects. Afterwards there can be shame, there can be guilt, and in some cases the mourning of someone you believed you knew and could trust, because they obviously broke that trust. Always get checked for STIs, okay? And you don't need to tell them it was due to SA. Just putting that out there. And there can also be intimacy issues. Something I've experienced. Many of these things I've actually experienced myself. But yes, there can be intimacy issues. Substance disorder, anxiety, depression, and of course PTSD can be present, as well as a lack of sense of safety in general. Imagine that. Risky sexual behavior, nausea, headaches, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, difficulty with sleeping, feeling jumpy or more prone to being, easily startled, and difficulty with concentrating. I may have repeated myself. I am sorry, but this really does rile me up, because I know a lot of people have gone through this, both men and women, and being a man who has gone through this, it really does get to me. And sometimes it can even result in self-canceling. And I am so sorry for all of the censored words I've had to use in this video, but YouTube. I don't understand it because I think they're important things to talk about, and if you put a disclaimer in the beginning of the video, as I did, I don't see why those words should be flagged. But anyways, back to the subject. If this happens to you, this is something that you need to unpack with a therapist for genuine healing. Just go into a bit of what you've experienced it on after the effect. That can be daunting. Every bit of this is daunting. Before, as it's happening, you don't believe it. During it, you don't believe it. After, you don't believe it. You question everything. Your sanity. You just don't know what to do. And I completely understand that. I myself have been SA'd in a multiple different kinds of ways. Grooming, forcefully, while incredibly drunk and not able to give consent while the other person was sober with someone I trusted. And all of them felt different. All of them had a different effect on me. During my childhood, it was a frequent occurrence, and that was something that I for a while thought it was normal, and then it was something I really had to come to terms with, and it's something I'm still dealing with to this day from my childhood. Then it happened in my adulthood a couple of times. And in fact, I remember recently there was a time I said to my husband, you know, if a year passes where I don't get essayed, it feels odd. And I said it as a one-off comment. I wasn't even really trying to dig deeper into it. And he was taken aback by that comment. And seeing his face and his response to that really showed me how much I have been truly affected by this. It has caused definitely PTSD, has definitely caused some intimacy issues, it has caused um me to want to self-cancel myself. And being here, being a survivor, I just want any man to know, whether you're straight, gay, anything, that even though there is so much stigma around men being SA'd, especially if you're SA'd by a woman, that that does not invalidate your experience, and that you are worthy of healing. You are worthy to go on and attempt to heal. And it's going to be hard. Like I said, I'm still working through it, but it can be done. And there needs to be more research done into this, and more lifelines, you know? It is a fact. We are 20 years behind in research and help and lifelines than women are. And that is just not okay. Inequality in any form for any gender, for any person, is not okay. And so I just want to leave you with the fact that I am so sorry if you have gone through this. If you know someone who has gone through this, please be patient for them. There was one time that was forceful, that was random, and it was at night, and for a year it was hard for me to leave the house. It's still hard for me to leave the house, but back then, forget it. So there is help, and you can always call the National SA Hotline at 1-800-656-4673. It is 100% confidential. So if you don't want to do the therapist, if you don't want to tell your girlfriend, your boyfriend, if you don't want to report, because truth be told, I never reported. I I don't blame people who don't report, though I do blame myself for not reporting some of them. But ultimately, that is your choice. So just know that even though there is all this limited research, and we are 20 years behind and all this, that there is still help out there. There are still ways to navigate it and lean on your support people and try your best to just thrive. And it will take a while, and let it. let yourself heal. And I just want to say thank you for watching. And I really hope that some of this shed light on just how far behind we are with men in SA, being essayed, I should say. So, that's been Bipolar Afterthoughts. I'll see you in the next one.